Something strange is happening on their end. You have not said anything. You have not sent the confrontational message, or made the accusatory call, or shown up demanding the explanation you probably deserve. You have simply been quiet, present in your own life, absent from the specific ongoing project of managing the connection and interpreting the signals and adjusting your behavior in response to whatever the avoidant's current emotional temperature requires. You have, in the most straightforward sense, stopped engaging with the dynamic, and the avoidant is losing their mind about problems that don't exist. They are replaying conversations that ended fine and finding problems in them. They are constructing narratives about what your silence means that have no foundation in anything you have actually done or said. They are manufacturing grievances, small, sourceless, impossible to pin down grievances that seem to appear from nowhere and carry a disproportionate emotional charge relative to their apparent content. They are, in the specific language of this title, creating imaginary problems with you, generating conflict in the absence of conflict, building drama in the space where your silence sits. Understanding why, understanding what is actually happening in the avoidant psychology when silence produces this specific, seemingly irrational behavior, is what changes how you read it, because the imaginary problems are not random. They are not evidence of the avoidant being fundamentally unreasonable or unstable. They are the specific, predictable, psychologically coherent response of a regulatory system that has lost its primary input and is generating substitute inputs to keep itself operational. The regulatory system, as has been examined throughout this series, runs on specific inputs: your responses, your engagement. Your emotional availability is the target against which the deactivating strategies orient themselves, the pursuit that the ambiguity keeps active, the warmth seeking that the coolness generates and then rewards with the return of warmth. All of these inputs were throughout the dynamic, providing the raw material that the architecture needed to maintain its regulatory function. Your silence removed them, not gradually, genuinely. The absence of engagement is not a reduced version of engagement. It is the actual removal of the input supply. And a regulatory system that has been running on a specific set of inputs, deprived suddenly of those inputs, does not simply stop. It searches. It reaches for substitutes. It generates, from whatever material is available, something that can serve the function that the removed inputs were serving. What material is available in the silence? In the absence of your actual responses to respond to, the avoidance system has access to one thing: the imagination, the memory of previous interactions, the reconstruction of what you might be thinking or feeling or planning in the absence of any direct communication, the interpretation of the silence itself as a form of communication, and the specific anxiety-generating interpretation that the threat response system prefers, which is the interpretation that finds in the silence evidence of a problem. The imaginary problems are the system generating substitute inputs from the only available material. Since you are not providing real engagement to manage, the system is creating imagined engagement to manage. Since you are not expressing real grievances, the system is constructing imagined grievances to respond to. Since the silence is not giving the architecture anything to regulate against, the architecture is populating the silence with invented content that restores its regulatory function. This is a genuinely important reframe, because the imaginary problems encountered without this understanding look like something else entirely. They look like the avoidant picking fights, like manufactured drama from someone who is not getting the attention they want and is creating conflict to produce it. Like a particular kind of emotional immaturity, the inability to tolerate the absence of engagement without generating chaos to fill the gap. There is something to that surface reading, but it is incomplete in a way that matters. The behavior is not primarily attention-seeking in the conscious, deliberate sense. It is system maintenance in the automatic, pre-reflective sense. The architecture is not choosing to manufacture problems because it has calculated that problems will produce a response. The architecture is generating the problems automatically, as the consequence of its regulatory function, requiring inputs that the silence is not providing. The distinction matters because it changes what the behavior is communicating. Conscious, deliberate attention seeking says something about the avoidance character. Automatic system maintenance says something about the avoidance psychological state. Specifically, it says that the system is under sufficient stress from the absence of its primary inputs, that it is beginning to generate substitute inputs from internal material, which is a sign of the architecture's deterioration under conditions it was not built to sustain. The imaginary problems are evidence of the system struggling, of the regulatory architecture operating outside its normal parameters, of a psychology that has been running on your engagement as a necessary resource and is now, in the resource's absence, showing the specific signs of resource deprivation that the imaginary content represents. The content of the imaginary problems has a specific character that reflects their origin. They are almost never completely invented from nothing. They are reconstructions, the avoidance system taking genuine ambiguities from past interactions, genuine moments of imperfect communication, genuine instances where meaning could theoretically be interpreted multiple ways, and running those ambiguous moments through the threat response filter until a problem emerges. The conversation that ended with a slightly short reply 3 weeks ago, the system reconstructs it and finds evidence of irritation you may not have been feeling. The time you didn't respond immediately, the system reconstructs it and finds evidence of deliberate withdrawal. The moment where your tone was slightly different from usual, the system reconstructs it and finds evidence of a shift in feeling that may have existed only in the reconstruction. These reconstructions are not random. The threat response filter that the system runs them through is looking for specific things, looking for the evidence that confirms the prediction the template has always been generating. The prediction that the closeness will eventually produce the thing that makes closeness dangerous. And in the absence of current evidence, either confirming or disconfirming the prediction, the system turns to historical material and processes it through the filter until the material yields what the filter is looking for. The imaginary problems are the filter finding its confirmation in reconstructed material. The system has manufactured the evidence it was always predicting it would eventually receive. What this produces in the avoidance experience is something that genuinely feels real to them. This is the part that makes the imaginary problems so specifically confusing and so specifically maddening from your position if you are aware enough of the dynamic to know that the problems are imaginary. The avoidant is not performing concern about these reconstructed problems. They are genuinely experiencing concern. The filter's processing of the historical material has produced a genuine emotional response, genuine felt anxiety about a problem that does not exist outside the filter's construction of it. This genuine emotional response creates genuine behavioral outputs. The avoidant may reach out to address the imaginary problem, may send the message that asks if you are okay, or that references the thing they have reconstructed as problematic, or that opens with a casual contact that is carrying the weight of the reconstructed anxiety, or they may not reach out directly, but may show up in shared contexts with the specific quality of someone who is managing something, slightly more careful, slightly more attentive to your reactions, slightly more organized around reading your signals than the normal baseline. Both of these behavioral outputs, the direct reaching and the heightened signal reading, are versions of the same thing, the system seeking the input it needs, reaching toward the engagement your silence has removed, generating the problem because the problem, once communicated to you, invites the response that restores the regulatory function. Your response to the imaginary problem would be the input the system is missing. Your reassurance that the problem is imaginary would be the engagement that fills the silence. The specific cruelty of this dynamic, and it is a cruelty that neither person designed, but both people are navigating. Is that the most natural response to someone expressing concern about a problem in their relationship? Is to address the concern, to reassure, to clarify, to do the relational work of resolving the apparent misunderstanding. This is what genuine care looks like in a functioning relationship. This is the reasonable, decent, caring response to someone who appears to be worried about something. It is also exactly what the system was generating the imaginary problem to produce, not through conscious calculation, but structurally. The imaginary problem communicated to you invites a reassuring response. The reassuring response is engagement. Engagement is the input the system was missing. The imaginary problem has functionally restored the input supply. If you provide the reassurance, the system has successfully generated a substitute input. The architecture has maintained its operational status by producing the inputs its silence was failing to provide. And crucially, the silence has been broken. Your engagement has been restored, not because you chose to end the silence from your own genuine center, but because the imaginary problem manufactured the conditions that made ending the silence feel necessary from yours. This is not manipulation in the deliberate sense. It is the system's automatic, pre-reflective operation, producing an outcome that serves the system's regulatory needs without any conscious direction. The avoidant is not sitting down and deciding to manufacture a problem in order to produce your engagement. The problem emerges from the filter's operation on available material, produces genuine emotional distress in the avoidant, and the genuine distress produces the outward communication that invites your response. The whole sequence runs below the level of conscious intention, but the outcome is the same regardless of whether the sequence was conscious. Your silence has been interrupted. Your engagement has been restored. The system has found a way to restore its inputs through means other than the genuine, direct, honest communication of what is actually happening in the avoidance interior, which would be, of course, the acknowledgement that the silence is affecting them, that the absence of your engagement is producing the specific, maintenance, costly, architecture-straining difficulty that has been described throughout this examination. The imaginary problem is the avoidance system finding a way to tell you that the silence is affecting them without allowing the avoidant to actually say that the silence is affecting them. This is worth sitting with because it is one of the more precise illustrations of the architecture's operation in contexts where the honest communication would require the acknowledgement of need. The genuine message, your silence is affecting me. I am experiencing your absence is significant. The absence of your engagement is producing something in me that I am struggling to manage, is not available to the avoidance system as direct communication. It requires the specific, vulnerability exposing acknowledgement of genuine need that the architecture was built to prevent. So the system finds an indirect route. It generates a problem. The problem communicates through the back channel of apparent relational concern the genuine content of what the direct communication would say. Something is wrong between us. Something has changed. I am aware of the distance, and it is producing something uncomfortable. These messages are present in the imaginary problem, encoded in the concern about the reconstructed grievance, available to anyone who can read the indirect communication accurately. You can read it accurately. This is one of the things that the full arc of your understanding of this dynamic has built in you. The capacity to hear what the indirect communication is actually saying without being recruited into responding to the surface content of the imaginary problem as though the surface content were the actual message. Responding to the surface content, engaging with the imaginary problem as a real problem, providing the reassurance that the manufactured concern is designed to elicit has a specific cost that is worth being clear about. The cost is not the time or the emotional labor of the response, though those are real. The cost is the restoration of the dynamic in the form the system was running before the silence interrupted it. The cost is the return to the configuration in which your engagement is organized around the management of the avoidance emotional state, rather than around your own genuine center. The imaginary problem, responded to as a real problem, is the silence ending on the avoidance terms, rather than your own. Is the architecture finding a way to restore the conditions it requires through the indirect route of your genuine care being recruited in the service of addressing something that does not actually need addressing? Not responding to the surface content is not cruelty. It is the honest reading of what is actually happening and the honest refusal to participate in the indirect route, when the honest route, the acknowledgement of what the avoidant is actually experiencing, is available to them if they choose to take it. What the honest route looks like, the direct communication that the architecture is working around, is the avoidant saying something that sounds approximately like, "Your absence is affecting me and I don't know how to say that directly, so I am finding indirect ways to restore contact." The architecture will not produce this communication spontaneously. It requires the specific, usually therapeutic kind of support that helps people identify the indirect communication routes their system uses and practice the direct ones instead. What you can do, not as a therapeutic intervention, but as the honest, clear expression of someone who understands what is happening, is decline to engage with the indirect route while leaving the direct route genuinely open. Not through a speech about the dynamic or an explanation of the architecture's operation, through the simple, grounded, non-dramatic quality of your response to the imaginary problem, the response that neither confirms the problem as real nor dismisses the genuine underlying experience that the problem is expressing, something that acknowledges the person without engaging with the manufactured content, something that communicates through its quality rather than its explicit content, that you see past the surface to what is actually present, that you are not going to be recruited into addressing a problem that doesn't exist, and that the thing that does exist, the genuine, uncomfortable, silence-produced experience the avoidant is having, is something you are aware of and something that deserves direct acknowledgement rather than the indirect management that the imaginary problem was attempting to produce. This quality of response is possible only in the became version of you. The previous version, organized around the management of the avoidant's comfort, calibrating its expression against the avoidant's likely response, would have engaged with the imaginary problem, would have provided the reassurance, would have done the relational work of resolving the apparent misunderstanding because the apparent misunderstanding looked like a real thing to address. The became version sees the architecture's operation clearly enough to read the indirect communication accurately, knows the difference between a genuine relational problem that requires genuine engagement and an imaginary problem that the system generated to restore the input supply, can hold warmth for the genuine underlying experience, the difficulty the silence is producing, the architecture's struggle with the absence of its primary inputs, without being recruited into addressing the imaginary surface content. This capacity to see clearly and respond to what is actually present rather than to what is being presented is one of the specific, concrete expression of what the became version of you looks like in practice. Not abstract self-possession, the specific, moment-to-moment, interaction level expression of genuine clarity in the face of the architecture's indirect communications. The imaginary problems will continue as long as the silence continues, and the architecture has not found a more direct route to what it is actually seeking. They may escalate before they resolve. The system, finding that the standard imaginary problem is not producing the expected response, may generate more elaborate or more emotionally charged versions in search of the engagement level that will finally recruit your response. The escalation is not evidence that the problems are becoming more real. It is evidence that the system is increasing the intensity of the input generation in response to the continued absence of the expected outputs. The more elaborate the imaginary problem, the more significant the architecture's difficulty with the silence, and the more important it is to maintain the clarity that distinguishes between the elaborate surface and the simple underlying reality. The simple underlying reality is always the same. The silence is affecting them. The absence of your engagement is producing something in the avoidance interior that the architecture is struggling to manage. The imaginary problems are the struggle finding its indirect expression. Your silence is doing what it always does when it is genuine and sustained and rooted in your own actual development, rather than in strategy. It is creating the conditions in which the avoidance system has to encounter itself, without the buffer of your engagement, standing between the architecture and the full experience of what it is running against. The imaginary problems are the architecture encountering itself, generating its own noise in the absence of the external noise it was running on, populating your silence with invented content, because the silence, unmediated, is too clear a mirror for the system to remain in front of comfortably. You don't need to address the invented content. You are the mirror. The clarity is yours. The silence is doing its work. Let it. The silence keeps working after you stop thinking about it. This is one of its less discussed qualities, the way it continues doing its psychological work in the avoidance interior, independent of any attention you direct toward it. You are living your life, invested in the things that genuinely engage you, present to the people who are genuinely present to you. The silence is simply the natural condition of someone who is no longer organized around the question of another person. It is not maintained, it is not monitored, it is not a strategy you are tending. It is simply the honest expression of where your attention actually is. And in the avoidance interior, it keeps building, keeps creating the conditions for the imaginary problems, keeps stripping away the cover that your engagement always provided, keeps doing the quiet, unglamorous, entirely impersonal work of holding up the mirror that the architecture has no adequate response to. The imaginary problems, in this context, are worth examining more fully than their surface content suggests, because each imaginary problem is a data point, not about you, about the avoidance current internal state, about where the architecture is in its process of encountering the silence and what that encounter is producing. And the data, read accurately, tells a specific story about the progression of what is happening in the avoidance interior. The early imaginary problems tend to be small and specific, reconstructions of minor ambiguities. The slightly short reply, the unreturned message that could be attributed to busyness, the tone that was perhaps slightly different from usual. The system is searching for small confirmations, running the threat filter over the lowest stakes material first, finding the smallest available evidence for the prediction it is always generating. These early problems have a quality of reach to them. The system is reaching for confirmation that the silence represents something, a shift in feeling, a developing grievance, the approaching confirmation of the prediction, and finding it in material that, viewed without the filter, carries no such confirmation. The middle stage imaginary problems are more elaborate. The system, having run the minor material through the filter without producing the engagement that would restore the regulatory function, begins constructing more significant scenarios. The reconstruction of a conversation from weeks ago that in the fresh reconstruction carries a meaning it did not carry at the time. The interpretation of the silence itself as evidence of specific feeling, rather than as the simple, honest expression of someone who has moved their attention elsewhere. The generation of narratives about what you must be thinking or feeling or planning, narratives that are entirely invented, but that carry genuine emotional charge, because the threat filter is producing genuine anxiety from the invented material. The late-stage imaginary problems have a quality of desperation to them, not emotional desperation in the dramatic sense. The avoidance presentation remains largely intact. The surface composure is maintained, but the quality of the system generating increasingly significant imaginary content in search of the engagement level that will finally produce the response that restores the input supply. The problems become more serious, more pointed, more clearly demanding a response that would require genuine engagement rather than the easily deflected response that minor problems invite. Each stage tells you something specific about where the architecture is in its encounter with your silence. The early stage says the system is searching, but still has sufficient operational capacity to run the standard protocols against the available material. The middle stage says the standard protocols are producing insufficient yield from the available material, and the system is beginning to generate more elaborate substitute inputs. The late stage says the architecture is operating under significant resource strain, is consuming considerable psychological energy to maintain its regulatory function through the generation of increasingly elaborate, imaginary content, and the maintenance cost is approaching the level where the architecture may be forced toward a different response. The different response, the one the architecture has been working around through every stage of the imaginary problem generation, is the direct one, The acknowledgement, however partial and however imperfectly expressed, that the silence is producing something real in the avoidant, that the absence of your engagement is being experienced as significant, that the imaginary problems are the system's indirect way of communicating something it has not yet developed the capacity to communicate directly. The direct response is not guaranteed. Many avoidants never produce it, cycling through the stages of imaginary problem generation indefinitely, without finding the internal resources for the genuine acknowledgement that would end the cycle honestly. Some produce a version of it, a reaching out that is more honest than the imaginary problem communications, but still incomplete, still carrying more indirection than the genuine acknowledgement would require. And some, particularly those whose architecture has been sufficiently strained by the silence's sustained work and whose internal development has reached a sufficient stage, produce something genuinely direct, something that communicates, however imperfectly, the actual experience rather than the manufactured proxy for it. Your position in relation to all three possibilities is worth examining, because the position is specific to the became version of you and is different from the position the previous version occupied. The previous version, organized around the question of the avoidant, calibrating its responses against the avoidant's emotional temperature, was vulnerable to the imaginary problem strategy at every stage. The early stage problems produced engagement because genuine care produces the response to apparent concern. The middle stage problems produced deeper engagement because the more serious the apparent problem, the more genuine care motivates genuine response. The late stage problems, by the time they arrived, had typically succeeded in restoring enough engagement that the silence had been effectively broken and the regulatory input supply restored. The became version is differently positioned, not because it lacks genuine care. The became version carries genuine care that is, if anything, more grounded and more real than the anxious care the previous version carried. But because the genuine care is no longer organized around the management of the avoidance emotional state as its primary expression, that became version's genuine care expresses itself in the honest response to what is actually present, rather than in the management of the surface content of what is being communicated, which means the imaginary problems at every stage are received with the same quality of grounded, non-anxious, seeing past the surface clarity. The early stage small reconstruction is not addressed as a real problem because it is not a real problem. The middle stage elaborate scenario is not engaged with as genuine grievance because it is not genuine grievance. The late stage pointed communication is not responded to with the depth of engagement it is calibrated to invite, because the depth of engagement it is calibrated to invite is the specific input the system was, generating the problem to produce. What the became version offers instead, at every stage, to every imaginary problem, is the consistent, grounded, warmly present quality of someone who is genuinely available for honest engagement and specifically unavailable for managed substitute engagement. Someone whose care is real and whose clarity about what the care responds to is equally real. This consistent quality, available for honest, unavailable for managed, is perhaps the most specifically challenging thing the became version of you presents to the avoidance architecture, because it removes the gradient. The architecture was running on a gradient, the gradient between the levels of your engagement that corresponded to different levels of its input generation. Small problem, moderate engagement. Bigger problem, deeper engagement. Biggest problem, full engagement. The gradient was the mechanism's calibration tool. It could adjust the scale of the imaginary problem to produce the scale of engagement it required. The became version removes the gradient by holding the same quality of response regardless of the scale of the imaginary problem. Small reconstruction, same response. Elaborate scenario, same response. Pointed late-stage communication, same response. Not identical responses in terms of content. The became version responds to what is actually present in each communication, which varies, but identical in the essential quality, the warmth that is genuine and the clarity that is non-negotiable, and the seeing past the surface that does not waver regardless of how elaborate the surface becomes. Without the gradient, the architecture cannot calibrate, cannot find the problem size that produces the engagement scale it requires, cannot adjust the input generation to produce the specific output it is searching for. The mechanism reaches for the calibration tool and finds it absent, finds instead the same quality meeting it at every level of the imaginary problem's elaboration. And the same quality at every level is the one quality the mechanism cannot process into the regulatory function it requires. The genuine, clear, warmly present, non-manageable quality of the became version of you. The architecture's response to finding its calibration tool absent, to encountering the same non-manageable quality, regardless of the scale of the imaginary problem it generates, is one of three things. The first is escalation beyond the manageable. The generation of a problem so significant, so pointed, so demanding of genuine engagement that the became version's clarity cannot be maintained against the genuine care that the scale of the apparent problem activates. This escalation occasionally works, occasionally finds the level at which genuine care overrides the clarity, but it requires a degree of elaboration that begins to reveal the imagination's origin. Problems that are too elaborate, too conveniently constructed, too perfectly calibrated to the specific vulnerabilities of the relationship's history begin to carry the signature of their manufacturer. And the became version, with the specific pattern recognition that the full arc of development has built, is equipped to read that signature. The second is withdrawal. The architecture, finding the calibration tool absent and the imaginary problem strategy producing insufficient yield, returns to the regulatory tool it knows best, distance, the managed, defended, controlled distance that restores the architecture's equilibrium by removing the became version of you from the proximity where the calibration failures are occurring. The withdrawal is not relief. The silence and the became version were already providing the distance. The withdrawal is the architecture retreating from the encounter with its own limitations that the became version's consistent quality was producing. The third, the rarest and the most significant, is the direct route. The architecture, exhausted by the failed calibration attempts and the escalation that revealed the manufacturer and the withdrawal that restored nothing, finding that the only remaining route to something genuine is the genuine route. The acknowledgement, however imperfect and however incompletely expressed, of what the imaginary problems were always actually about. The silence, the absence, the specific uncomfortable, maintenance-costly reality of your genuine non-engagement and what that non-engagement is producing in the avoidance interior. When the direct route is taken, when something genuinely honest breaks through the architecture's indirect communication preference, what tends to come out is proportional to the pressure that has been building. The honest communication that finally surfaces after the full arc of the imaginary problem generation has the specific quality of something that was held too long before being expressed. It is not polished, not managed, not the carefully calibrated version of genuine feeling that the architecture's communication style normally produces. It has the raw, slightly overwhelming, not quite right words quality of genuine feeling that was suppressed past its manageable duration, finally finding an imperfect exit. The avoidant who has been generating imaginary problems for weeks or months, who has been running the elaborate reconstruction and the pointed late-stage communications and the escalation and the withdrawal, and who finally says something honest, says it with the accumulated weight of everything that the management was working against. What they say in this moment is not perfectly articulate. It is not the clean, complete, therapeutic quality acknowledgement of what has been happening. It is more likely to be something partial, something that communicates the genuine underlying reality, while still carrying traces of the architecture's preferred indirection. Something that says, in the imperfect language of a system that is not practiced in direct communication of genuine need, approximately this: the silence has been more present to me than I knew how to say. Your absence has weight. The imaginary problems were me not knowing how to tell you that. This communication, however imperfect, is the most honest thing the avoidant has produced in the full arc of the dynamic. It is the architecture's indirect preference finally being overridden by the genuine experience's insistence on expression. It is real. It deserves to be received as real, not as the confirmation of every hope, not as the signal that everything is resolved, but as the specific, genuine, hard-won, imperfectly expressed real thing that it is. What the became version of you does with this communication, if it arrives, is the expression of everything the becoming produced. It receives it warmly, because genuine honesty from someone whose architecture was built to prevent it deserves genuine warmth. It holds it clearly, because genuine honesty is not the same as the capacity to sustain what the honesty points toward, and the clarity that distinguishes between the two is the became version's most important instrument. It responds to what is actually present, the genuine underlying experience, not the imaginary problems that were its indirect expression, with the specific quality of honest engagement that the genuine underlying experience deserves and that the imaginary problems were never going to receive. The genuine underlying experience deserves this acknowledgement that the silence was real and intentional and rooted in something genuine in you, that the imaginary problems were read for what they were, not with judgment, but with the clear recognition of someone who understands the architecture well enough to read its indirect communications accurately, that the direct route, now that it has been taken, is welcomed in the specific way that honest communication always deserves to be welcomed, with the full, warm, non-anxious presence of someone who is always available for the honest thing and never available for the managed substitute. This welcome is not the same as the reconnection, is not the restoration of the previous dynamic, is not the signal that the silence is over and the engagement is restored, and the architecture can resume its regulatory operation with your responses as its primary input. It is the beginning of the only conversation that was ever worth having in this dynamic, the one about what was actually happening, what it actually cost, what genuine engagement actually requires from both people, what the avoidant is actually capable of offering, and what genuine development toward greater capacity actually looks like, and what the evidence of that development would need to demonstrate before the full investment of your genuine self is warranted. That conversation, honest, direct, clear-eyed on both sides, is what the silence was always pointing toward, not as a destination, but as a possibility that the imaginary problems in their own indirect, architecture-limited, finally exhausted way were always trying to reach. The silence created the conditions. The imaginary problems were the architecture's struggling, indirect, increasingly desperate attempt to find the route to what those conditions were making necessary. The direct route is the arrival, whether it comes and when, and what the became version of you does with it when it does. That is the story the silence has been building toward all along. Not with strategy, not with intention, with the honest, settled, non-negotiable quality of someone who stopped being available for the indirect routes and left, clearly and without apology, only the direct one open. That is the silence's final work, and it is, as all honest things ultimately are, enough.